Science has Albert Einstein. Literature has Shakespeare. Art has Picasso. Masters of their crafts who change the way we see things and the way we think. Compliance has its giants as well. And in Big Brains in Compliance, Tom Fox and Stephen Martin are talking to them. Join them every other week and learn from the best.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I am joined by my good friend, Stephen Martin, and we are doing something I've wanted to do literally for years, and that's have a podcast with Stephen. So, Stephen, we finally got our podcast. It's Big Brains in Compliance, and this is our introductory episode. So I thought what we should do is talk a little bit about our professional backgrounds and how that informed our journey into compliance. And I'm afraid to say yours is much more interesting than mine. So why don't you start?
Well, we both had interesting careers and backgrounds, I think. And yes, you have pushed me for years to have our own dedicated podcast. So I'm really looking forward to the Big Brain series and what we can do. And, both talking about compliance and how we think about it, but really also having some really interesting guests here that are truly the big brains in compliance and moving forward, the industry and talking about some really interesting topics. So I'm looking forward to it. In terms of compliance backgrounds, you and I have had really interesting careers, and I think we've learned a lot. So it'll be fun to share that with the audience.
So you started off, I believe, with the Attorney General of Missouri's office, and then you moved later to the Department of Justice. And what was that experience like for you working for the government as a prosecutor?
Yeah, it was interesting because, I came to the Missouri Attorney General's office right out of law school. And within the first 6 weeks before I was even licensed to the bar, I was arguing in front of the Court of Appeals and handling as general counsel to a couple state agencies, all of their litigation and legal needs. So it was really intense coming right out of law school. And it was great. I mean, it was a fantastic group of young lawyers who all came in. We had really interesting jobs. It was fun to work with the Attorney General, who then ultimately became the governor. But it was one of the highlights, certainly, of my career, just in terms of the experience you got. While a lot of our friends were moving into high-paying jobs in law firms and doing document production, we were actually, doing really interesting things, getting paid nothing, but having a lot of fun doing it. I remember one of the cases we worked on was the first case that had gone to a federal trial on campaign finance reform and ultimately went to the U.S. Supreme Court and, helped set the limits. And, you just don't get experiences like that without going to someplace like the Missouri Attorney General's office. So, I look very fondly at those days. You certainly had no idea what you were doing. As a lawyer, you're not really trained coming out of law school to be able to do much other than read thick legal books. And so you had to figure it out on the fly. And, for me, I love that. And that sort of set the trend for the rest of my career because, as we'll talk about, it became very interesting at certain points. And a lot of what you did there, just kind of, having to figure it out and being comfortable, not knowing the answers or learning the information on the fly was something that I very much valued.
Your work with the Department of Justice, was it Main Justice or were you outside of Main Justice?
I took a job after the Missouri Attorney General's office. I decided to move to Washington, D.C. I wanted to pursue an LLM in advanced litigation and environmental law at Georgetown and started looking for various jobs. Took a job on the Hill, actually, working for a congresswoman there as a legislative aide, but had been applying to the U.S. Attorney's offices for Maryland, Virginia, and D.C., and was lucky enough to get hired in D.C. as an assistant attorney. And, it was a great experience. I mean, at the time, Eric Holder was the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., and, it was just fantastic working for him. Again, you come in with a group, kind of a class of people that come in to be AUSAs, and you really bond. Some of the people that I were there are still my best friends, people that I'm in fantasy football leagues with. And it was just an incredible experience because you rotate through different divisions and you learn different things. You start often in appellate or, in the criminal side. In DC, since it's all criminal, they have misdemeanor, sexual assaults, all the way through felonies to murders to, all the white collar crime you see. So you get an incredible amount of trial experience. You are in court all the time, literally every day. And you really learn what it's like to be both a trial lawyer and a criminal prosecutor, but at the federal level. So DC's office, the U.S. Attorney's office there is very different than any other U.S. Attorney's office around the country, where you're truly a trial jock. And it was fun, great, incredible experience, incredible people.
And then you moved into three of perhaps the most unique positions I think I've ever heard one person have in their career. So why don't you walk us through some of that?
Yeah, you've been at a number of places where we've been speaking together on panels or just the two of us. And, anytime I tell this background, you kind of both get gasps and laughs. So it has been very interesting. So I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, sitting there, really enjoying the career. If you remember, this was back in the early 2000s with the stock option issues and some of those things that ended up happening. But I had gotten an opportunity to apply for a job with MCI WorldCom. And, it was used to be the MCI side and then WorldCom, and they had combined. And it was, a high flying tech company, explosive growth, really dominant in the market. It was a place, people wanted to go work. You had Bernie Evers and Scott Sullivan there, who were on Fortune's cover all the time, talking about, how amazing it was at WorldCom. So thinking about it, I thought, well, this looks like a really great opportunity to come in. I was going to join the litigation department, handle kind of government investigations, litigation resulting from kind of government issues. And it seemed like a great opportunity. And it was really before compliance, it was hitting the market, because I very much remember coming in and talking to my boss, who was a former AUSA as well, and talking about how we needed to have a code of conduct, right? And because WorldCom didn't have one. And, I remember debating whether to do just a domestic one and an international one, and whether you should do separate ones. And so we drafted up these great codes of conduct in the early days, and we're going to have them for WorldCom. And it ended up getting presented to Bernie Evers. And, his response was, why do we need that? We're the most ethical company I know. So I'll just let that sit in for a minute, because he spent, a number of years in prison ultimately. And that was kind of an interesting time. It was before all the collapse and the problems had occurred, but it was certainly telling when you look back at it. So, it was an incredible experience, really great team that was there. Again, a bunch of those are my very good friends. We have an MCI WorldCom football league. And I think one of our divisions is named the Evers division, and one's named the Sullivan division. So that's kind of fun. And we've been doing it now for, 20 years or whatever it's been. But it was a time where you also had to come in and really learn, about how is it working in corporate America, and, especially on high flying companies like that. And it was interesting. So I've learned a couple things there. One, I learned that you have to be very careful on how you negotiate for compensation, because I remember when I got the original offer, and I was actually sitting in a restaurant across the street from the guy who ultimately hired me, Tom O'Neill. He was in his office, and it was like 8:00 at night. He was leaving on vacation. He called me up, and I was literally on a restaurant on a window across the street. And I never told him this, but I could see him actually making me the offer when I was at the restaurant with some friends. And I remember being very excited about doing it. Ultimately came back and sort of negotiated for more stock options, but not any increase in salary. And I will tell you that as we talk about the other companies I've been with, I've learned that cash compensation sometimes is better than stock option compensation, especially if you're going to be in companies that have significant trouble. Because I think I joined at like $42 a share and left at 15 cents a share. So that's one of the lessons you learn. Two, companies can look like they're ethical or doing things the right way and really have serious and significant problems. One of the people I was very close to at WorldCom is a woman named Cynthia Cooper. She was Time Woman of the Year, one of the whistleblowers, and I worked very closely with her and her team. She's the one that uncovered ultimately the capitalizing expense and what brought down WorldCom. But we were working on a precursor to that investigation that also picked up a lot of traction. And it was really amazing to see somebody stand up in the face of unbelievable pressure and challenges, and knowing what she knew and what it was going to do to the company and to all the employees, but still had to do the right thing and blow the whistle and bring it forward. It was incredibly intense time there. We can talk some of these stories, I'll tell you, but none of us thought it was going to be good for our careers. Ultimately, it turned out to be fine for mine. But, a lot of people had lost all of their money and pensions and income, and the company collapsed and was ultimately sold, for pennies on the dollar through a process in the bankruptcy. And so very few people can, get to experience that in a good way. But it taught me not to be scared of things, when you're in-house in companies, like to be able to stand up and be able to understand what you need to do as a compliance officer. So those are a couple of lessons I learned. And WorldCom was a crazy, interesting time. And at the time, when you're associated with the biggest collapse in corporate America history, you kind of worry about what that means. But it did teach me some very valuable lessons.
So let's move forward to your career. You went back into private practice with some very high-powered firms, really focusing on compliance, but you did have a much broader remit. So I was wondering, I know you did investigations and helped companies think through how to set up compliance programs. What was that like for you, and what sort of did that teach you?
So it was an interesting transition, because I went from WorldCom, then I went to Quest, where I was investigative counsel and chief privacy officer. And then I went to Adelphia, where I was head of litigation and the vice president of compliance. Two companies that also had very significant problems, but I was brought in to help rebuild them with the management team there. So very different from WorldCom, but an incredible kind of 7 or 8 years of really intense in-house experience, massive government investigations, rebuilding the compliance program. And what I saw coming out of those was that there was really a need for practical advice, right? You have a lot of great law firms who have incredible former federal prosecutors that are really great at investigations and can do things that incredibly smart, incredibly good lawyers, but didn't understand compliance and didn't understand how it works in a compliance program on a day-to-day basis. You really have to be in-house. As you know, you were in-house, you were general counsel. There's a whole different way that things get handled. You have to think about how the board's going to respond, how senior management, you have to work with procurement, you have to work with accounting and finance. You're working with the business units and you're just much more in depth. And one of the things that's been crystal clear to me along the way is that, the best in compliance have to have that kind of experience. And so what I did is I approached Baker McKenzie and Paul McNulty, who used to be the head of that practice there, and said, hey, I really think there's an amazing opportunity out here to set up, kind of a client's consulting practice. And, worked with Baker, ultimately joined them and worked on building out kind of a separate LLC and approaching the market in a way that nobody else really had been doing, right? And, we're going to talk about this in other podcasts, but, we created this 5 elements of corporate compliance on what your effective compliance program looks like. I've now, worked on it where there are 6 elements based on the guidance and some of the changes that are there. But we really were doing proactive compliance and working with companies on, compliance program evaluation, enhancement, third-party program development, risk assessment, but just doing it in a much more practical way and delivering a different content and different information, different enhancement and recommendations than I think a lot of law firms were able to do based on the in-house experience. So it was really great. And I continued to build that out, with folks at Baker. And what was interesting about it is the market loved it, clients loved it, but law firms are not as suited as you would like to be thinking outside the box half the time. And Baker was just ahead of the curve, right? And so I spent 5 years there and it was great. We really did some really interesting things, a lot of global travel. I was gone all the time, which my wife, I think, didn't appreciate now in hindsight, looking back at it, but, did things all over the world in compliance. And really on a global perspective, Baker was an amazing place to work and be able to try and do something like that.
So tell us where you're at now and what you've brought to this new position.
So after I spent time at Baker, I went to Arnold Porter and was a partner in the white collar practice there. And Arnold Porter is an unbelievable firm. I mean, incredibly high quality lawyers, an amazing culture, a place to work. In fact, out of all the places I've worked, I think the culture at A&P was as strong or better than any of the places, just in terms of how people got along. And really, again, was focusing a little bit more on being a lawyer's lawyer there, but still trying to do the compliance side. And what was clear is as much as I loved A&P and the folks there, I just couldn't have a real end-to-end solution working in a law firm. Because, you don't have forensics, you don't have data analytics, you don't have really risk assessment people or accounting, fraud. As a lawyer, you can hire folks to do that. I got to know a group called StoneTurn through a friend of mine. And, I've been in the field for a long time and hadn't known them, but it was a really interesting boutique consulting firm, kind of global advisory firm that worked just primarily in investigations, compliance, and monitorships, and primarily through law firms. And I hired them to work on an investigation, a Me Too investigation of a CEO and CFO of a publicly traded company, and was really impressed with the team and how they worked. And then ultimately ended up pitching for a major monitorship together, where I think we were the number one choice and unfortunately had gotten conflicted out of that process. And, I sat down in Washington, D.C. with the founder of StoneTurn, and we were just talking about, his vision and what he's doing and what it looked like and what I saw in the compliance market and how I wanted to develop it direct to corporates. And it was just really a great fit. The culture of StoneTurn, which I've now joined as a partner and help lead up their direct to corporate compliance work and still do investigations as well, but primarily focus on proactive compliance, was just really an interesting place for me to go. Because here at StoneTurn, I have couple of us are former federal prosecutors. We've got a series of folks that are lawyers that have been general counsel and have been chief compliance officers. But then because the firm was really founded from folks that came from the Big Four accounting side, we've got accounting, forensics, data analytics. We have all kinds of risk folks. And it's really a true end-to-end solution. And then we also layer on people that have AML experience and trade compliance and, environmental and anti-bribery and corruption. And so what I can do now is bring much more of an end-to-end solution for companies, in the corporate market where they want help with things like compliance or investigations. And the other thing that's really interesting is it's way more cost effective. The rates and what we are able to charge because of the structure and the overhead and how we have set up the firm are way more competitive than kind of the major law firms, right? And so, especially when you're talking about proactive work and you can be cost effective, but also really help at a practical real world level, make a difference in compliance programs. I think that's a great niche in the market and something that our clients really appreciate. And so it was a great move. As much as I kind of miss being at A&P and the folks that I worked with there, it truly matched kind of my background in being able to be really a consultant to companies in the compliance and investigations area and work with them to, better their programs. So it's been really fun. It's really interesting. I think it's kind of where the market's headed. And it gives me, again, back to the kind of end-to-end solution for companies in their compliance program.
So my journey was a little bit different than that. I started off and I've always been on the civil side of things. I am a proud recovering trial lawyer, but that trial lawyer experience really gave me the focus to, you always have to think about who is your ultimate audience, who's the ultimate trier of fact, who's your ultimate judge. In the corporate world, you may have a CEO, you may have a board of directors. But once you leave the corporate stakeholder or shareholder role, then you have potentially others. You could have an arbitrator. You could have a Senate committee. It could be a judge. It could be a jury. It could be 6 to 12 people impaneled to hear your dispute. So I really learned that you have to think through when you draft an agreement, when you draft a contract. It's not simply the implications of the agreement and the language of the agreement, but how it's going to be viewed at the end of the day if it all really goes down the toilet and you have to go to some sort of impartial forum for a dispute resolution. But from there, I moved into the corporate world, and being in Houston, an energy company, of course, was my choice. And in the corporate world, I did international transactions, and that really was my first exposure to working with others. And I was very much the ugly Texan. It's like, boys, this is how we're going to do it. And we had a English language only policy for our 100,000 plus employees across the globe. And they could all speak English, but it was a second language for most of them. So that was a really interesting challenge I had to learn to how to communicate my Texas legal terms to others across the globe. And I will tell you that indemnity blows the mind of anyone who's in a civil litigation company or a civil law country. But the other thing was, this was sort of 2004 timeframe, and I didn't know it at the time, but when I was first hired, I had 2 projects that had direct compliance implications. And I remember my boss came in and he said, look, I'm really sorry to have to ask you to do this, but we've got 214 agents and 71 joint ventures, and we need all of those agreements analyzed. So here's the key to the file room. We'll see you later. And it turned out to be a fabulous assignment. I didn't know it at the time because it was as a part of an internal investigation. But I got to read all of those agent agreements, literally across the globe, all of the joint venture agreements, some incredibly well written, some 40 years old. And it really taught me, and sometimes they actually did diligence on the agents, sometimes not so much. But I got to see what was really doing diligence all about. From there, I became a general counsel of a company that in 2007 had the largest FCPA fine in the history of the world ever, $27 million. Doesn't even make the top 30 anymore. But that was really my formative experience around compliance. And the reason it was so formative was we had an incredibly robust monitor. And I tell people, I'm not quite sure what your professional experience has been, but mine has been the most difficult people I've had to work with and for were also the people I learned the most from. This fellow, this guy, he had forms that I still use today. He was so far ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about compliance programs, but it was very lawyer driven, policies and procedures, written documents. But he viewed supply chain as the highest risk, even higher than third party agents. So that was very interesting in 2007. No one thought about your compliance risk and supply chain. And from there, I went out on my own. And much like you, Stephen, I recognized a market opportunity that in 2010, there were very few lawyers in private practice who did the nuts and bolts of compliance, or as you would phrase it, an end-to-end solution. So I decided to focus on that, and I did that for many years. And that really gave me the opportunity to help design, create, and implement compliance programs literally from the ground up. As part of a marketing effort for that, I started blogging and following whatever commentary there was. And back then there was not too much. In fact, I was the third blog around FCPA compliance that started. That experience has led to podcasting. But the biggest thing is I had to learn. I'm intensely curious anyway, but it gave me the opportunity to learn and to watch and see the evolution of compliance from the regulators to the companies to the advisors like yourself and myself, seeing how it's implemented. And so that's really what I want to do in this podcast is you and I get to talk to people who have seen this evolution, are part of this evolution, and are going forward into lots of different areas that when we started in compliance and when you started writing a code of conduct, that was probably revolutionary. It was certainly an evolutionary step, but we're so far past that now. And frankly, I can't wait to see where we can take this show.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's fun to hear your background too. I mean, obviously I've known it for a while, but the audience and most people think Texan is kind of a different language anyway. So you were already battling that separate from English, but you did have an interesting run, having to go through the DPA and deal with, what was a major problem at the time. And, it's been really fun to watch you build out, this entire network and become one of the gurus around FCPA and compliance, generally in all the things we've done. So it'll be really fun. I think for me, what I'm really excited about with the Big Brain series is, the types of guests that we get to bring on here and, who we're going to get to talk to and just have some fun stories and talk about how compliance evolving, changing, and really, get both a little bit more personal, but also a little bit more practical than a lot of the things that are out there in terms of compliance. So really looking forward to what we can do with our fun new series.
There's a lot of top practitioners out there who have tried some really interesting things. And I tell people that the only thing you're limited by in compliance is your imagination. And there have been some incredibly imaginative things. It can be as one of my favorite examples is the New York Times broke the story of the Walmart scandal in Mexico on a Sunday with a story above the fold on the front page. And the next morning at about 9:00, I called a guy just to say, hey, you might want to go talk to your senior management about that. He goes, Tom, I took the New York Times into that 8:00 Monday morning meeting and said, do you want to be above the fold? And that's all he had to say.
Right.
And it was a great lesson. He had a great visual and he was way ahead of the crowd and curve in talking to management about here's what can happen. And this could happen to us if we don't have an effective compliance program. So that's really one of my favorite stories of how something so creative yet so simple can be so powerful.
I agree. I mean, and there's, lots of interesting things that you and I have learned along the way, but it's also going to be fun to talk to people who are chief compliance officers now, folks that are in, major law firms, people that have gone to do different things in the world and just, kind of bring a different view and a fun approach to thinking about compliance. And that's why we're trying to do it kind of, witty and tongue in cheek with Big Brains and compliance, and maybe it'll lead to our own TV series as well, Tom, who knows?
I can't think of a better note to end this first episode on, Stephen. I look forward to seeing where we take this show.
All right. I look forward to it as well. Thanks, Tom.